The mind-numbing boredom of quarantine and the isolation caused by COVID has caused all of us to turn to new fads or re-adopt fads of the past in search of any entertainment we can get. Who hasn't seen a social media post of someone baking sourdough bread, trying whipped coffee, or attempting the newest TikTok dance? However, there's one face that hasn't made a comeback, yet deserves a second look. It's time we all don our polyester leisure suits and gold chains as we jungle boogie through the groovy sound of the 1970s. Disco. By embracing disco as a form of entertainment while we attempt to avoid any Saturday night fevers during this pandemic, we can better understand its unique cultural relevance and see that you and I will survive all this hot stuff. The music we identify as disco first emerged in the early 1970s and began to replace artists like the Monkees and the Beach Boys in favor of the fresh sound of groups like ABBA and the Bee Gees. Born out of exclusive, membership-only clubs throughout the U.S., disco flew below the radar of the general public because of its role as a reaction against the mainstream white rock groups of the time. The term disco was first coined when venues in Paris began using turntables instead of live bands to play music for clubgoers in the early 1940s, causing some of the world's very first nightclubs to be considered discotheques. However, disco music as a style didn't emerge until the mid-1960s, when New York clubs began playing music similar stylistically to Eurodisco, supporting artists like Jerry Butler. Up until this point, the group disco catered to was exclusive and stayed out of the public eye. But soon, mainstream insight into these venues led to Disco Inferno in the US that we think of today. In 1971, disco was televised for the first time ever through the Soul Train music and dancing show. And after music critic Vince Aletti began attending the dance club The Loft, he became motivated to publish the first ever article about disco in the Rolling Stone, titled Discotheque Rock. This public exposure caused underground clubs to grow and accommodate high-tech speakers, large crowds donning their best platform shoes, and of course, the classic disco ball. Prior to 1970, disco had largely been ignored by radio stations. But by the time 1978 rolled around, there were 200 disco-only radio stations in the US alone. At this point, everyone was saying "I love the nightlife," resulting in Donna Summer, ABBA, and the Bee Gees topping charts and staying alive in our playlist today. From its conception, disco has been an art form of resistance. The clubs in Europe that laid the groundwork for disco stylistically arose as a form of Nazi resistance, as Hitler continually labeled music created by non-white artists as degenerate influences. This led French resistance groups to create hidden dance clubs called discotheques, describing venues where turntables or jukeboxes were used to play music, effectively turning the beat around. The influence of the discotheque was also prominent within the USSR, where even under Stalin's harsh rule, dancing at disco clubs was permitted. However, soon the USSR began to freak out as disco culture began to be seen as subversive. DJs became subject to strict regulation, and each dancing event required a statement for the reason of the dance, and the music was censored heavily by the Communist Party. There was no love train for disco. We remember jazz for the way it amplified black artists in the 1920s, rock and roll for the way it acted as a rebellious movement against established norms in the 60s. But when we think back on disco, it conjures images of flashy lights, mass-produced music, and blatant commercialism. There was no love hangover for the style, and society's perception of disco as a 70s fad means that we miss out on the nuances of the music and the way it has changed our society at large. To begin, the voices of popular songs were less masculine, and actually, for once, were primarily female. And the club setting of the music meant that singers were no longer asked to water down their lyrics to make them radio-friendly, allowing artists to deliver messages of potent sexuality and power through their music, giving us classics like Shake Your Booty and Do You Think I'm Sexy? This focus on sexuality via music made a dramatic departure from the past, where the few songs that didn't sweep sexuality under the rug would focus on the desire that women created in men. However, prominent artists like Donna Summer recentered this narrative, and making their songs centered around female pleasure and the power that women derived from embracing their sexuality, causing singles like Love to Love You Baby to top charts for months at a time. The empowerment disco fostered arose partially as a result of the victories the second wave feminism had garnered in the early 1970s, with the ERA gaining traction and the passage of Title IX alongside the Roe v. Wade decision. These newfound changes in attitudes toward femininity and sexuality reflected themselves in disco's fashion scene, where spandex bodywear, wrap dresses, and billowy pants began to become the must-have pieces. Many feminists denounced disco fashion, labeling it as objectification of the female body, but designers and dancers alike defended their style. Much like the lyrics of the songs themselves, disco fashion was about empowerment for the individual, allowing clubgoers to choose from styles that ran the gamut from modest to revealing. Additionally, disco encouraged a newfound focus on men's fashion, and gave men the freedom to partake in traditionally feminine styles and focused on their appearance free of judgment. Disco uniquely contributed to the empowerment of female artists, as well as a more positive perception of femininity and open sexuality. Additionally, don't stop till you get enough, because disco's unique cultural blend engendered the success of fresh Black and Latinx artists who became wildly successful after previously being shunned artistically by society. Black music had previously been seen as primitive, but now, disco's roots in funk derived from soul soon became a crucial vehicle in displaying Black culture and uplifting Black singers. The persistent use of Black rhythms in disco, as well as the use of chanted phrases, shows the way it diverged from the music at the time. The physical space disco occupied began to become a symbol of equality as well. Before disco's popularity, most dancing was restricted to couples dancing and only for males and females. Dancing between two males had actually begun outlawed in New York City. However, disco broke this norm and instead catered to large group dancing, creating a safe space for LGBTQ individuals where same-sex couples were able to dance together and enjoy the nightlife. Clubs like the Saints, or the Vatican of disco, claimed spaces and aesthetics that were traditionally heteronormative and turned them on their heads to create clubs that were a safe space for LGBTQ+ individuals to express themselves. When examining today's society, the movement has still left its mark. For starters, by pioneering the 12-inch single to lengthen dance tracks, disco has, in turn, contributed to the songs we listen to today being lengthier, giving us all more time to act as dancing queens. Additionally, disco gave rise to DJing as a common practice. Since dance culture was a key component to disco stylistically, DJs matched the music they played to the reactions of the crowd by using techniques like listening ahead or mixing through headphones to ensure a seamless blend between the two tunes. And the rhythmic undertones, synths, and repetition of the music have all become mainstays in the pop music we all enjoy today. But most importantly, disco amplified the voices of artists whose society continually overlooked, and created physical space through dance that was unique and inclusive. But soon, the tarnish of disco's commercialism led to its last dance. When disco became perceived as popular, it created an influx of white working-class youth into the scene, which subsequently led to the gentrification of the genre. For the most part, LGBTQ+ and Black artists were able to retain their success, but independent record labels and smaller artists soon became overtaken by the saturated music that reflected the commercialism of the time, as disco's audience became increasingly white and heterosexual. The Disco Sucks movement came to represent the pinnacle of resentment from rock fans. Rooted in racism and homophobia, the largest known Death to Disco rally was held in late July of 1979. At Disco Demolition Night, fans got a reduced price if they brought a record to be destroyed to see the White Sox play, leading to a crowd of 59,000 people attending. Records of not only disco music, but also Black and LGBTQ artists in general were blown up and burned on the field. As journalist Dave March reflected, young white males were the most prominent group in attendance, because they were the ones who felt threatened by disco's success. After Demolition Night, the mass production of disco caused the music to become seen as oversaturated and cheap, and it became aired less and less on the radio as the months went on. However, the downfall of disco led to artists' shift to new forms of music, like boogie music and house, that birthed modern-day Latin freestyle, techno, electronica, and EDM. Today, Disco rarely makes the appearance on occasionally radio throwbacks and the odd playlists. Other genres of music still get recognition for the footprint they have left on society, and are revered for their successes. And yet, most of us still perceive disco as superficial, tacky music, overlooking the complexities and the cultural value it holds. Instead, we should take a chance on meaningful disco music and see how it allows us to progress as individuals and society. Because it's about time we realize that we are family and it's all a boogie wonderland.